In the various wars of the late 19th and first half of the 20th century, including World War I and World War II, soldiers from all nations found that in addition to tools and also bayonets on the end of their rifles, they also had use for fighting knives, and various types of fighting knives were developed, particularly in World War I and World War II. And today we're going to be looking at what I consider to be possibly the best American fighting knife of World War II. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and of course Easton Antique Arms as well. I'm an antique arms dealer and that's why I've got these lovely things here to show you today. So we're going to be looking specifically here at the US M3 fighting knife. But before we get to that, an important bit of context. Throughout the 19th century, various armies around the world had tried to combine the sidearm, that is a form of short sword, with the bayonet, that is the thing that you put on the end of a rifle to defend yourself in hand-to-hand combat or raid a trench or a building, and indeed to defend against cavalry charges, and also various types of tool and knife. Now, it should be obvious to anyone that if you're a soldier in the field on campaign, you might require tools. Some tools are for digging, some are for chopping up wood, some are for cutting foliage to make a clear line of sight for guns, for example, artillery. And there's various other reasons why you might want to have something that's combined between a bayonet, a tool, and a fighting knife. Now, why do I differentiate between a bayonet and a fighting knife? Well, quite simply, by the time we get to the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, we've got various forms of sword bayonet or knife bayonet. This is a very common World War I period, 1907 pattern British SMLE sword bayonet. What came before this was a slightly shorter double-edged version, the 1903, but fundamentally these are to be attached to the end of your rifle to use in all the normal bayonet kind of ways, but in addition they have a hilt. Obviously a lot of earlier bayonets just had a socket, so they just attached to the end of the musket or rifle, and you couldn't really use the thing in hand very easily. However, once we start to get knife and sword bayonets, as this was referred to, this can be used as a fighting knife. And we should mention, before we delve into the world of specialised fighting knives, that throughout World War I and World War II, bayonets were probably the most commonly used fighting knife used in hand, and pretty much every infantry soldier who wasn't equipped with something like a machine gun or something, or a submachine gun, would have one of these. So anybody with a rifle or a carbine would have some form of knife or sword bayonet. And in fact, people like the US Marines were trained to use these as fighting knives, pretty much like a big Bowie knife, by people like Biddle, and there were systemized kind of methods, techniques and systems for teaching how to fight with these things. For example, against the Japanese or the Germans or whoever happened to be the enemy that those particular soldiers were going to face. So they were taught how to use these in close combat, and a lot of those fighting methods were based on older 19th century knife fighting styles. But there's a few problems with the bayonet used as a fighting knife. One of those is, certainly by the time we get to World War I, a lot of these are relatively long, and that is a matter of reach. There was almost a degree of competitiveness between the reach of people's rifles and bayonets, and the idea was, around the year 1900 and up to World War I, that you would be at a disadvantage if your combined length of your rifle and your bayonet was not as long as that of your opponent, because they'd be able to outreach you, and there's a degree of truth to this. And this was exacerbated by the fact that a lot of the rifles had got shorter at the beginning of the 20th century, and therefore the bayonets, like this 1907 compared to the 1903 that went before it, got longer to compensate for the newer, shorter rifles. So not only do these become quite long and could say unwieldy in a trench or an urban fighting situation as a fighting knife, but in addition you've got to remember that the main purpose of a bayonet is to be attached on the end of your rifle. So should someone jump on you and grapple you, this isn't necessarily the best weapon to be using if you can access a knife instead. So therefore, in World War I, with the prevalence of things like trench raids, particularly at night time, but it could be daytime as well, we see the rise of things like this French trench knife called the Vengeur, or Avenger of 1870. That was because obviously the French had lost to the Prussians in the War of 1870, and so World War I was seen as a chance to get revenge, and so this was known as essentially the Avenger, the Vengeance of 1870. And this is a really purposeful double-edged fighting knife. It's got a cross guard, it's got a very simple grip, they could be mass produced, and these were used in their absolute thousands in the trenches of World War I. Most nations came up with their version of the trench knife or combat knife. What the Americans came up with in 1917, and in fact they took to the trenches when they joined the Western Front towards the end of World War I, was this, the model 1917 trench knife. And you see it has a handguard on it, it has a triangular stabbing blade for punching through thick winter uniforms, and it, you know, it's a very simple but purposeful dagger. We've looked at this in a previous video, so if you haven't seen that already, check that out. But daggers like the American 1917 are really only useful in a combat situation, and there were many combat knives that still tried to marry this idea of being both a weapon and a tool. And that's more or less how we end up in World War II with the US Ka-Bar. Now this is a video of course about the M3, which is sort of could be seen as the competitor or rival to the Ka-Bar. We're going to talk about how they compare in a second. But this isn't a video about the Ka-Bar. I will do a video on the Ka-Bar in the future. I've been asked to for a long time, and I will get around to that. But all you need to know for the purposes of this video is the big difference between the Ka-Bar and the M3 is the M3 is a dedicated dagger or fighting knife. The Ka-Bar, from its very outset, and the whole MO of it, was to be partially a tool and partially a weapon. And that was adopted by the US Navy and the Marines. So initially, at least, the Ka-Bar was really the knife, the fighting knife of the Navy and the Marines. The M3, however, was the fighting knife of the army. But as I've mentioned, most of the army had bayonets, and in fact this was certainly initially the primary, not this because this is British, although they did have some British rifles actually, but this was the Garand, for example, was the standard sort of sidearm fighting weapon of most infantry. So why did they need a fighting knife? Well, that's where we get to the M3. So essentially this initially was supposed to equip the troops who didn't have, army soldiers who didn't have a bayonet. Who did that include? Well, anybody carrying, for example, a light machine gun, because if you've got a light machine gun, it doesn't have a bayonet lug on it, and you don't have a bayonet. If you're equipped, you know, if you're manning a mortar or something like that, or if you've got a submachine gun like a Thompson, for example, doesn't have a bayonet fitting on it. So for all of these soldiers who were armed with things other than rifles or carbines that could fit a bayonet, they got the M3. However, these were made in such large numbers that in reality, these also equipped, for example, Army Rangers and parachute troops, as well as in the end, just a lot of people in the army. So a lot of people who did have bayonets would have ended up with these M3s. So before we unsheath this, let's have a little look at this. But the scabbard is an interesting thing by itself. So this is the kind of updated or improved version. This is the M8A1. There was an M8 that went before that. And indeed the original scabbards of the first generation of M3s were actually leather with metal fittings. But they quickly found that those wore out too quickly. And also, you know, in terms of kind of economy as well. Remember, they were making huge numbers of armaments in World War II, so they needed to make things as cheaply as possible. So we end up with a cotton and sort of resin construction here. It's kind of like an early form of plastic, or almost like fiberglass. It's very, very tough. It's actually got cotton fiber in there, so it's a bit like some of the modern knife making materials. But importantly, this is not only very durable and easy to mass produce, but it's also waterproof, which is good as well. Leather, of course, would soak up water. We've got a simple webbing belt loop at the back, and we have a little push stud to keep it secure there. And it has a leaf spring inside, so that even when that's undone, the knife or dagger can't fall out. Very important when this is being issued to people jumping out of planes with parachutes on it, incidentally. But, you know, just for anyone running around, that's really important. So it's held in by a spring, leaf spring inside. And you'll notice, right, let's have a look at the dagger. So the main way that this diverges and differs to the Ka-Bar, it's actually got quite a similar grip, we'll get to that in a second, is the blade. The blade is principally almost double-edged, so you'll notice it is straight parallel edged with a spear point, and it is double-edged for about the top 3 inches up here and then edged all the way along the front. So it has a front and a back. Obviously you could hold it other way around, each way around, but it does have a front and a back. So the front has a full edge, the back has a half edge. Now this is actually a really cool construction, and we see this in some of the Wilkinson officers' swords behind me. It's a bit like a backsword construction. It's really good because you end up with a thick spine. If the blade was entirely double-edged, and we'll look at a comparable dagger in a second, which is, that would make the blade weaker. So this is both very strong, relatively speaking, we'll talk about that as well in a second, but also it has a double-edged spear point, which is better for penetrating thick clothing like winter coats or smocks, these kinds of things. I would say better for penetrating thick clothing, far better in fact, than the Ka-Bar point. Now this is one of the, and we'll look at the Ka-Bar in depth in a future video, but this is one of the drawbacks of the Ka-Bar blade design, is the tip is not very well designed for penetrating resistive materials. Okay, this is better for that, and therefore I would describe this as a better dedicated fighting knife. Is it the best? We'll compare it with something else in a second. It has a guard here. Now this guard is actually bent up on both quillons. In fact, usually the front one here is straight and just the back is curved up, and that's for you to put the thumb up against in a saber grip. The grip is quite short. It was originally made of ribbed leather and then latterly made of stacked leather washers. And this stacked leather washer method of construction was so successful in World War II that it was copied by lots of civilian knives and daggers thereafter. And it has essentially, well, you could call it a pommel, but it's essentially a thick steel washer acting as a pommel at the end. And that in compression compresses down all of the leather washers, and then it is peened at the end there. Okay, so it's a really, and it's got a fairly thick tang. It's a really simple knife that has both a good penetrating point, some ability to cut, although that's not really what it's for, a relatively short grip, and we'll talk about the shortness of the grip in a second, that is ribbed for a good secure grip. And it's just a really simple construction that's easy to mass produce, relatively strong, but still relatively kind of slender tipped for penetration. Now at this point we're going to talk fleetingly about the British rival, that is the Fairbairn Sykes. Now I've done quite a few videos about the Fairbairn Sykes. This is a third pattern. So this is the model that was most commonly used in World War II, particularly the last sort of year or two of World War II. And this dates to around that period as well. And now this was designed originally for British commandos. Now famously the emblem of the commandos, parachute regiment, but also Marines, also used by the SAS and the SBS. Now, this is a very particular type of what's sometimes termed stiletto. I'm not a huge fan of the use of that term because stiletto in the 17th century has a particular type of dagger in mind, and it's very different to this. This is an edged dagger, which stilettos traditionally weren't. So it's double-edged, and you'll notice it is all quite slender. Now if I grab that M3 again and compare these two things, they look relatively different to each other. I can tell you that the Fairbairn Sykes dagger blade is far more slender and therefore better at getting through things like thick clothing. However, it is also far more fragile. There is no real sensible way in which you can use a Fairbairn Sykes as a tool. You could use it perhaps for filleting fish and things like this, but not as a kind of rough usage tool. You could get away with using the M3 as a tool to some extent. Not as much as the Ka-Bar. The Ka-Bar was designed more as a tool than the M3 was, but the M3 is definitely a more sturdy and kind of stronger, essentially, dagger than the Fairbairn Sykes is. They also have very different grips. Now, the guards functionally are not actually that different, but if we talk about the grip, so the grip on the Fairbairn Sykes is a very particular thing, and this comes from William Fairbairn's own kind of theories about how a dagger should be, and you will notice that it balances in the hand. If I put my finger at the balance point, it's quite distinctive and unusual in that the Fairbairn Sykes actually balances in the hilt. Most other daggers and swords from history balance just above the guard in the blade. The balance point's in the blade. Very unusual that this balances in the grip, and that's what he wanted, and it was a very particular and peculiar, I have to say, hilt or kind of weapon design. This, however, also, interestingly, balances in the grip. Now that, statistically, as I mentioned, that's quite unusual. If we look at most daggers and knives, and obviously swords from history, most of them balance in the blade. So the fact that the M3 balances also in the grip makes me wonder if there was some degree of kind of acknowledgement of the Fairbairn Sykes design, and this was perhaps somehow partially inspired by that. I don't know, that's pure conjecture. But I do actually prefer the grip on the M3, although it's cruder and more basic and less attractive, you could say. Functionally, it's actually a slightly bigger and more ergonomic grip, and I find it easier to hold on to than the Fairbairn Sykes grip. Moreover, the Fairbairn Sykes grip is completely cylindrical, so if you do want to use the edges, you can only feel where the edge is, you can only index it by finding the crossguard. You find the crossguard and you find the edge. However, with the M3, it actually has a slightly flattened grip shape, which isn't always the case with these, and it isn't always the case either with the Ka-Bar. Some of them do have more cylindrical grips, but this particular one is quite flattened here, and I find that quite interesting because it gives you better edge alignment should you need it. If you need to cut through a rope or a strap or something like that, it's quite useful being able to feel which direction your edge is pointing in. So without going into too much depth, which do I think is better out of the Fairbairn Sykes and the M3? Well, I think actually the Fairbairn Sykes is a better dagger for special forces who are probably more highly trained and less likely to be using this as a tool. And I do think that this is a better weapon for your common infantryman. And that's basically the roles that they fulfilled. This is a cruder, simpler weapon for your average soldier, and this is probably a more specific sort of murdering weapon for covert forces. Now obviously in World War II, just like going all the way back to the model 1909 Bolo knife, there were other more specialised forms of large knife that could be used as fighting weapons, could be used as tools sometimes. We're not really looking at those here because these are a very different thing and they're not so easy to carry. They're not something that your typical infantryman wants to be carrying around. The beauty of something like the Fairbairn Sykes or the M3 is it can be carried really easily and you'd pretty much not notice that it was even there. And in fact, that's when we come to the size of the whole thing. So when I initially looked at this knife, I was quite surprised by relatively how small it was. So the Fairbairn Sykes has a blade which is just under 7 inches long. The M3 is a little bit shorter than that. It's about 6 3/4 inches. This particular one has obviously been resharpened and slightly the tip been reshaped. So this is actually more like 6.5 inches. And that did strike me as somewhat on the short side. Moreover, the grip struck me as somewhat on the short side as well. But do you know what? You've got to bear in mind that people like US paratroopers and rangers and stuff in World War II, their primary job is to jump out of planes, take positions, shoot at things with any type of firearm they've got, throw grenades, operate mortars, this kind of stuff. This is really a last-ditch backup for if something goes horribly wrong in a building or a trench or something like that. And therefore, what you principally want from a standard fighting knife of this period is ease of carry and secureness of carry. And they have absolutely nailed it with the M3. It's absolutely secure in the scabbard. The scabbard's easy to wear. The hilt is relatively short and the blade is relatively short. So you can wear it anywhere and do pretty much anything. And you can secure it in various positions on your equipment and not even really notice it's there. Now, specifically in a World War II context, one of the other great things that the M3 had going for it is it took less steel to make than a Ka-Bar. Quite simply, there is less metal in that blade than there is in a Ka-Bar blade. And in World War II, that was an important factor. So the M3 came into military service in the US military in March 1943 and initially was just given to Rangers, parachutes, essentially shock troops. However, it was then thereafter, as more numbers became available in 1944 and 1945, rolled out to air crew, people with submachine guns and carbines and all kinds of troops. So it became very, very prevalent in the US Army. Now, during the war, millions of these literally were made. This one's actually made by Case, who were about the 4th, I think, biggest manufacturer. The biggest manufacturer of these, incidentally, was the Imperial Knife Company, but Case made about 300,000, so a lot, but even they were only about the 3rd or 4th biggest manufacturer of these, so these were made in absolute millions. It seems to have been generally well received and well liked. Some people preferred the Ka-Bar. One criticism of the M3 was that it wasn't as durable as the Ka-Bar when used as a tool. but it wasn't supposed to be a tool. So I would kind of almost throw away that comment. If you're using it as a tool, then yes, the Ka-Bar is a better knife. If you're using it as a stiletto, then clearly the M3 is a better dagger. And coming full circle, we talked about trying to combine various knives and tools into bayonets, so you could just carry one instead of having a bayonet and something else as well. And eventually that happened to the M3 as well, in the form of the M4, which was the bayonet for the M1 carbine. So this was eventually turned into a form of bayonet, and which essentially replaced this in standard usage. Now, I know a lot of you out there love the Ka-Bar, and it does look really cool, and it's a perfectly good knife. You may have sensed through this video that I'm more of a fan of the M3. As a fighting knife, I think the M3 is better than the Ka-Bar, although I don't have a Ka-Bar in hand, so let's look forward to doing a comparison video when I get my hands on an original Ka-Bar. So for now, it's over and out. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be. Check that you're subscribed, and I hope we'll see you back on the channel really soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.